Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Welcome to today's show, everybody. Today I have a special treat for you. It definitely was a special treat for me. I got a chance to sit down with one of my favorites in this field, Dr. Carrie Jones. Dr. Jones is a naturopathic doctor like myself, and she's also has her master's in public health. And, you know, many people see me as kind of like, Jade, you're sort of the hormone metabolism expert. And I would consider her more of an expert in hormones than me. She's one of the people that I learn an awful lot from and have just come to really just love her whole vibe and the way she educates. And she was gracious enough to come on the show and give us a lot of pointers. And this is one of these discussions. Many people who listen to my podcast are very advanced health and fitness enthusiasts. And I think the vast majority of people are actually professionals in some way. We have health coaches, personal trainers, physical therapists, chiropractors, medical doctors, naturopathic doctors. And so Carrie and I kind of went in depth on some things to give you some advanced understanding. And I think you come to expect that from this particular show. But one of the things I love about Dr. Carrie Jones is she is able to teach in a way that is very relatable, even for those of you who may not be super expertise in this area. And so I think there's going to be something for everybody in here. She's also the medical director for the Dutch test, and I just want you to be aware of that because this is something that many of you will want to sort of look at and sort of understand, and we discuss that a little bit. But definitely check her out. On Instagram is where she spends most of her time and does a huge amount of education for us all. She's at dr.carriejones, CarrieJones, at Dr.Carrie on Instagram. And make sure you go and follow her. Enjoy the show. She's absolutely wonderful. And definitely go over there and tell her you listen to the show and give her some feedback. Tell her she's wonderful and thank her for her time. And I really hope that you enjoy the show with Dr. Carrie Jones. Let's get started. Dr. Carrie Jones, how are you, my friend?
I am fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for being here. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Carrie Jones, she, a lot of people see me as the hormone expert, but she is actually what I would consider the real hormone expert and is someone who has been, sort of educating all of us in this field. And so I wanted to have you on to, really get some of this stuff clear and discuss, some of the stuff that's super confusing around hormones. But let's just start out with the simple stuff and just basically tell us how you got into this work, a little bit about your background, and then I'm going to grill you on some things that people have been dying to know about hormones.
I hope I have an answer. So
Yeah,
much
exactly.
like yourself, I'm a naturopathic doctor and I have my master's in public health and women's health, hormones, gynecology is literally the only thing I've ever wanted to do since I was a little kid. I knew I wanted to be a doctor in the field of women's health. I did a little detour. I thought I wanted to be an OBGYN and then I realized what it takes to actually deliver a baby. I'm like, you know what? I think I'd rather just get you pregnant and pass you off. So, and then come back to me once those midwives and those OBs got you under control. So that's what I did. That's what I studied. And it's funny. My boss says we're an inch wide and a mile deep, So if you've got knee problems, don't ask me. If you've got kid problems, I have no idea.
Yeah.
If you've got a hormone question, I probably can help you solve it.
Yeah, isn't that funny in our field? I oftentimes say the same things. Like people ask me a lot of stuff, and we do get a wide breadth of knowledge, but we do
Hmm.
tend to, a lot of us do tend to go very deep in particular areas. And you and I
Yeah.
have kind of done that. My area is essentially metabolism and hormones for weight loss. Yours is deep dive into all things hormones and endocrinology. So we're both endocrinologists in a sense. I would call
Hmm.
us functional
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
endocrinologists. But you've been at the forefront of teaching many physicians and other healthcare providers about the new ways of testing hormones and also about the ways that we should be thinking about hormones kind of differently. And people who listen to this podcast are pretty savvy. So you got
Okay.
a lot of professionals that are going to be listening to us. Mainly personal trainers, but also MDs and NDs, and then some very savvy lay individuals. And so
Hmm.
I want to cover some things that will be, some things that may even stump you and I together that we'll discuss. But
Okay.
one of the first things I want to jump into with you that I'm curious about, and I have an
Uh-huh.
interest in this, is the idea of stress and stress hormones and how they are impacting things. Specifically, one of the things I want to address first, and we'll kind of just jump right into this, is this idea of stress hormones and pregnenolone or progesterone steal. Is this actually a real thing? And for those who don't,
No.
okay, so no. And so give us a brief primer on this, because I have a funny story to tell you after this. But give us a brief primer on where this whole thing came from, stress
Yeah.
hormones and how they impact sex steroids and the idea of progesterone steal, if you don't mind.
So, I mean, I was taught it just like you were. I was taught to steal. And the where it came from was when you look at a steroid pathway and you're looking where it starts at cholesterol and you just follow the arrows all the way down to testosterone or progesterone or cortisol or estradiol, wherever you're going. That steroid pathways, I have one right around here, but it's
I know
usually right.
we all
I
have
know
this
I'm
somewhere
like,
on our wall.
it's like right here somewhere in this mess. It's just an 8.5, by 11 piece of paper. And so everybody assumes when you follow those arrows, that's what happens in every single cell in the whole body. And you can just interject where there's an arrow. So if you see pregnenolone, I was taught if you just take pregnenolone, then you can influence that particular arrow. Until I revisited biochemistry and physiology. And physiology says when you go to make a sex steroid hormone, cholesterol is the first step, no matter what, for most all of these hormones. So if you're trying to get a cell in your ovary to make progesterone, which is the lutein cell, then it's going to start with cholesterol. The star protein binds to cholesterol and kicks off the whole cascade. And it happens in the mitochondria, transitions into the endoplasmic reticulum, circles back to the mitochondria, and then goes out into circulation. So that's an ovarian lutein cell. Now let's pretend you're in the adrenal glands and you need to make cortisol. So the zona fasciculata will make cortisol through the same series of steps. Star protein, cholesterol moves through, pregnenolone, progesterone, but cortisol. And as far as we know, those mitochondria in the endoplasmic reticulum aren't stealing from one another. And because you can't just give pregnenolone and raise progesterone 1-to-1, it's not like here's pregnenolone, it's going to magically turn into progesterone. It can't. It's not the backbone. It's not the first step. So as far as we know, the progesterone and pregnenolone steal does not happen because those cells are not stealing from one another. My mitochondria and my ovaries, my mitochondria and my adrenals don't have some like sneaky back alley discussion going on where they're swapping and stealing. So
Yeah.
as far as I know, maybe they do and they're not telling me.
Yeah, and so that's such an interesting point, right? Because same thing for me. The idea for me, as I always understood, is you have progesterone that's being released by the ovaries. Let's say it's circulating through the blood, and the adrenal glands suck that up like a sponge, and then shuttle it into these mitochondria, and then make cortisol out of it because you need cortisol. And
Nope.
this is not necessarily something that it sounds like you, the expert, and me sort of looking at this necessarily agree upon. But a funny
Right.
story is that when I was recently at the Institute for Functional Medicine conference, and I was shocked that they were still kind of teaching that
Yeah.
particular model. And I do think clinically speaking, it can get us in the right ballpark about what is happening with stress steroids and the relationship between sex steroids and stress hormones, but it's not actually probably physiologically what's going on. So walk us through what exactly is happening then, and what's the relationship? Like stress does lower these hormones, correct?
100%, but it does it at the brain. So let's think about it. You've got, and we'll just stick with women, but it happens to men too, but women are just a little easier to describe. So when you make cortisol, it will circle back up to the brain, and let me back up. Reproduction is what women are put on this planet for. Whether you want to get pregnant or not, I am not implying that. It is what women do. It's why we get a cycle every month, or we're supposed to, right? So the brain literally judges everything we do as, are we healthy enough for reproduction to continue forward? And so if you are in a massively stressed out state, you have lots of cortisol floating around, the brain goes, oh, hell no. No, we should not get pregnant this month. And what happens is there's a negative feedback loop up in the brain at the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And the cortisol will go up to the brain, and subsequently the brain will slow down the two hormones that encourage estradiol and progesterone production, FSH and LH. Now, your FSH and LH are made in different amplitudes and frequencies. So your cortisol may just shut down your LH enough that you don't make progesterone, but you still make estrogen. So it can make you really estrogen dominant. Or the real stressed out person, and plenty of your listeners will raise their hand at this, they've gone through stressful situations, whether it's a divorce, something at work, the holidays, their kid got sick, and they will skip their period altogether because the amplitude and frequency of all the brain hormones, FSH, LH, just go down quite a bit. And now they're not ovulating, they're not making estrogen, they're not producing, they're not pushing the follicles forward. So 100% cortisol affects these hormones. It's just not a steal. It's more a negative feedback.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. All right. So you can see why I have Dr. Jones on the show, because she is just expert at this. So then it brings me to sort of the next sort of question in this, as we stay on the whole idea of cortisol. Let's talk a little bit about adrenal fatigue, or, this whole concept that the adrenals essentially get tired out. Again, it's one of these things that may give us some useful clinical understanding, but it may not be the actual thing that's going on. And so what is actually happening there with stress and then the adrenals?
Adrenal fatigue is sexy, right? It's easy to understand. People are like, I have bad fatigue, and cortisol is made in the adrenals. It must be what I have, adrenal fatigue. Unless somebody has Addison's disease, Addison's is the true autoimmune where you don't make cortisol. What really happens again is that HPA axis, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, has a feedback loop. So much like there's an ovarian feedback loop, there is a cortisol feedback loop. So when you are in a really stressful state making lots of cortisol, it will cycle back up to the brain, and the brain will go, okay, that's enough, right? That's enough, we're done. And the hypothalamus and the pituitary will stop making the two hormones that subsequently make cortisol. So you get this progressive downgrade to make cortisol. It's more from like a waterfall rush down to a trickle. And so you probably made a lot of cortisol at some point in your life. And then, over time, the feedback loop kicks in and your cortisol production goes down. So you don't fatigue as in like you don't lose cells. It's not like the ovaries, where the ovaries go through menopause. Like your adrenals don't go through menopause. You're not losing follicles like you do in the ovaries. Yeah. But you definitely can have this feedback loop. And this feedback loop can last for a while if no changes are made, right? And so it's from a brain down. But adrenal fatigue sounds sexy. It's really easy to say, rolls off the tongue, makes for a great book title. So
yeah, and a lot of us in this field, right? I certainly don't have a problem with the term. It does kind of explain things, but I do have, once you get into talking to practitioners, that's not actually what is happening. And so it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, and just for everyone listening, it sounds like what you're saying is that there's no ovarian fatigue, so to speak. There's no adrenal fatigue, so to speak. There's no thyroid fatigue, so to speak. It's essentially brain fatigue, let's say, and specifically hypothalamic fatigue, and these hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, thyroid, and ovarian axes that are being negatively impacted by chronic stress, particularly cortisol.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what the new, that's what's so exciting was the new sort of as medicine moves forward, as functional medicine moves forward, I'm seeing more and more practitioners, more and more supplement companies, more and more labs realize, I mean, this physiology isn't new. It's not like in 2019, the human body was like, you know what, we're going to switch and start going for the brain. Like this has been our physiology since the dawn of day.
Yeah.
And so now though that people are realizing when we address the adrenals, it's not like we micro focus in on the adrenals. We have to step back and look from the brain down. And I love that so many companies and like I said, practitioners are like, hey, what's going on with the brain? Like, let's look higher because that's really where it's coming from, or not.
Yeah. Let me ask you this about, because when I think about, and I want to see if you agree with me or if you want to correct some of my thought on this. When I think about stress and people tell me, hey, Jade, I'm stressed.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think about if you're feeling stressed, that's not typically cortisol. It's typically adrenaline if you're feeling it, right? If you're kind of feeling anxious and wired. Cortisol is sort of like this stealth stress hormone. And you kind of have both of these. Typically, acutely, you kick off adrenaline first, and cortisol is somewhat delayed. Are both of these hormones negatively impacting the hypothalamus? Is it sort of one or the other? What's happening there? Because I think when people go, oh, I feel stressed out and I feel anxious, they typically think cortisol, which is probably correct, but that's probably not the hormone that's making them feel that way. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
No, it's true, but it's also, it's even bigger than that, because think about it. When you have a lot of adrenaline and a lot of cortisol, what's the big inhibitory hormone that goes down? GABA, right? So GABA is your big anti-anxiety hormone. And what happens when you're feeling stressed out? You feel anxious. So you get this, it's like, it's like pistons in a car. It's like these go up, your cortisol, your adrenaline, your glutamate, right? All your trigger. And then the calming GABA, maybe serotonin, starts to go down, and it becomes this dance. And unfortunately, you become really dominant in the fight or flight side and not so strong in the rest and digest side. And as a result, you feel overwhelmed, you feel stressed out, you feel burned out, you feel, not as resilient as you used to. So absolutely, cortisol gets the blame. We talk about it all the time, but it's really actually all these hormones playing together. And then if we add in the other hormones, like for men, testosterone, all these hormones, your cortisol and adrenaline can affect your testosterone production. Testosterone is really helpful for men for energy, motivation, mood. What happens when they feel stressed out? They're not motivated, their mood sucks, and their energy goes down. It's very similar to women. They don't ovulate, they don't make progesterone. Progesterone is a very calming hormone because it affects GABA. And now you're doubly anxious and you can't sleep. And so it's just like this big web that just spins round and round. But it kicks off with adrenaline first and foremost, and then cortisol a little bit delayed later.
Yeah. So let me ask you the question I know you get asked a lot, right? And I get asked this a lot too. It's basically this thing of like, look, my weight is, I'm having trouble with my weight. Mm-hmm. I'm dealing with, metabolic slowdown or whatever it is. I can't lose weight. I think there's something wrong with my hormones. And then typically what they immediately think or someone thinks is that has to do with testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Well, you just alluded to there's this whole chemical symphony or chemical soup of hormones. And so I just want to get your sense and, just to kind of set us all straight. When you think of hormones and you think of what they are actually doing in the body, which ones would you prioritize, or which ones are you thinking about in relation to health, fitness, and fat loss? Because we usually jump right to the steroid sex hormones,
right?
But there's a whole other host of hormones, and it sounds like you're definitely prioritizing the stress hormones. And I'm wondering what else you prioritize, and where in that hierarchy are you really starting to look at sex steroids?
Absolutely. So it's really interesting. Sometimes I look at them all at once. I'll look at, we haven't mentioned, but like glucose and insulin, right? Leptin. Not many people give a lot of love to leptin, but leptin is a hormone that's made in the fat tissue, and it can be really interesting in the way it affects not only a woman's reproductive cycle, but also a way that it affects, the ability to trigger fat release in the body. And so thyroid has that often gets the big blame, right? So many people are like, I can't lose weight, I'm tired, it must be my thyroid. They get their thyroid tested and they're like, it's not my thyroid, but what could it be? And so absolutely, all of these hormones playing in a symphony have to be pretty dialed in for the most part. I find while people are working on their diet and their lifestyle and what they put in their mouth and how much energy they exert and those sort of things. But you can work on estrogen and progesterone all day long. You can give all the progesterone or chase tree you want, but if your insulin is in the double digits, and your blood sugar swinging all over the place because of your eating choices, like you're not going to lose weight. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it's, so I agree 1,000% on that. And one of the things that I look at with this, and my hierarchy would be, and I'd see what else you'd add, because I agree about leptin. I would essentially say when most people are thinking about hormones, it's a lot of the ones that, from my perspective, we don't even hear much about, like the incretins, the hunger hormones, leptin being a big one, but GLP and GIP and these other things. And then maybe adrenaline and cortisol and thyroid. And then sort of last, but of course not least, are sort of the sex steroids for me. Although these things definitely impact other hormones. And that's why it's so tough to have this conversation about one hormone versus another hormone, because they're socializing like people. So I oftentimes talk about estrogen as being, it's definitely reduces the impact of cortisol. So does progesterone. Estrogen definitely sensitizes the body to insulin. So it's not that they matter, but I love that you're essentially saying, look, if your insulin is going sky high because you're eating stuff like crazy, or your cortisol is going sky high because you can't control stress, these things are going to make it very difficult for estrogen and progesterone to help you at all. And
it's just going back to the basics, right? So if I have somebody in front of me who's struggling to lose weight and they're like, I think it's my hormones, I want my estrogen and progesterone checked. We can, absolutely, if that's what you want to do. But at the same time, I'm like, you've just told me you're not sleeping, right? Like you've just told me that you're on your phone and your tablet late at night. You just told me like what you do and don't eat. You just told me you have 2 glasses of wine every night before bed. You just told me, so all of these basic stuff, you don't hydrate, you don't like water, so you don't drink it. You live on caffeine in the morning because you're tired. If we just go back to the basics, I bet even just correcting things like hydrate and sleep would probably fix a lot of your hormones in general.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I want to get into is some of, obviously you're the expert in testing, so I definitely want to get into that in a minute, but also what I want to talk about is this idea that when you're thinking about balancing hormones, and I know this is like, it's tough when you're doing interviews like this, right? Because you're kind of put on the spot clinically, but if you had to say the 1, 2, or 3 things that you would say, hey, if you made these changes, a lot of people are going to clear up some of their imbalances in their hormones. What would you say those are? I know you named a few, but I want to pin you down on 1, 2, or 3.
Specific. It's actually a lot of the things you say, which is why I love following you so much and have for years, because I'm like, yes, that's why I say the same thing. Like twinning.
I know, I'm like that with you all the time too.
Hashtag twinning, yes. I would say my biggest thing now is as I really look into the circadian rhythm research. So, right, you're supposed to be up in the morning, down at night. Humans should naturally follow the darkness and the lightness. And so what I'm finding is if I tell people, like, look, when you get up in the morning, I want you to get some full spectrum light, whether it's you buy a light box off of Amazon, that's full spectrum, or you live in a sunny location like California, and you can actually go outside and get some sun exposure, open up your drapes, what have you. Do that first thing in the morning. And then at night before bed, about 1 to 2 hours before bed, I need you in dim light. I need you off your phones, your tablets. I need you, using your blue light blocking glasses and winding down. And it's hard. It's really hard. It's hard for me. But when I do it, when I get off my screen at night and when I live in Portland, Oregon, and it's currently raining. All this brightness you see is fake.
I know. I was going to say, it looks like the sun's out where you are, but
heck no. We got a little mini ring light. Like, come on now. I have a full spectrum light that I use in the morning. It honestly makes a world of difference. And as I dive into circadian rhythm, it has a huge impact on reproductive rhythm as well. So for those women who are struggling with irregular cycles or no cycles or trying to get pregnant or they don't ovulate in a timely manner or very well, like, man, if we just nailed your sleep, I bet it would fix 50% of your reproductive issues. So sleep is like my number one, absolutely. The number 2 thing is hydration. I've been looking into hydration and its effect on cortisol, especially in athletes. Randomly, I came across a study in PubMed, and of course, that made me go down a rabbit hole.
Love when that happens.
Right? And then just to show, there's all these studies, of course, because, NFL, NHL, all these, major multi-million, billion-dollar industries and sports have the money to do this research, and they need their athletes to be in tip-top shape. And to show that dehydration, even a little bit of dehydration, affects sports performance significantly. And I'm like, man, that's at an elite level. Imagine if you're just the average Joe or Jane Doe who just gets to the end of the day and they're like, oh, I had 2 cups of coffee. Man, I haven't had anything else to drink. Or, your people listening to this right now are like, oh, I've only had 1 glass of water today. I mean, that's actually really can be pretty stressful to the body and the brain, right? We're talking about the brain. And it's the brain that needs the hydration first and foremost. And then the third thing is movement. You gotta move. And all the time you're talking about like, just go for a walk, right? What do you call that kind of movement? When you call it something. Not like
leisurely
exercise,
and leisurely walking. Yep.
There you go.
Every time I'm in England lecturing, they go, "It's leisurely, leisurely, whatever you call it."
Yes, leisure. I say leisure. It's like when I say estrogen, they're like, it starts with an O. I'm like, no,
I know exactly. It's fun lecturing overseas.
Oh my gosh. And so that's my third thing. And I've been a fan of that since I was probably a kid. I am nosy. I like to look in my neighbors' windows. I like to see what my neighbors are up to. And so I am a big fan of going around my neighborhood and getting my 10,000 steps in because it makes a huge difference.
I mean, I love those answers. And it's funny, right? I love talking to other experts because the one that I would not be aware of, and would probably be way down on my list, is hydration. And now I love that because I'm just like, oh yes, absolutely, of course, right? And then we get to go in that direction. But for everyone listening, I think it's really wonderful to kind of see someone like Dr. Jones bring those things up because you're dealing with someone who sees lots of patients, reads lots of research, and does lots of education in this area. And there was nothing, super esoteric about any of that. It's very simple stuff.
Or
but
expensive.
To get a little bit esoteric and a little bit more on the other side, what would you say in terms of dealing with this stuff just from a simple supplement point of view before we start getting into testing and then potentially bioidentical replacement and stuff like that? What are the things that you're typically doing when you're like, you know what, some of these lifestyle factors are not necessarily kicking it into gear. I'm going to use X, Y, or Z. What are your go-tos?
So I think I would lump it into groups. So the first thing for the most part is omega-3s. I'm a big fan. Fish oils, and I usually do higher doses for a lot of people. 2,000 to 5,000 milligrams a day is what I usually do. I find that with just because cells are lipid bilayers, and if we get and people are so inflamed, right? Fish oil, omega-3s are a really good way to just help ease up on that inflammation, help that lipid bilayer. When you have an estrogen that's in the cell and it needs to get out of the cell when it's going through detoxification, it requires a transporter. In the cell, it's water soluble, but the cell layer, of course, is lipid bilayer. So that transporter, as it moves, it needs the fluidity of the cell. It needs not the membrane not to be stiff to pull that estrogen out and get it across. Yeah. But that transporter also transports all sorts of chemicals and drugs and everything else that's been transformed into water soluble. So I tell people, if you've got stiff cells, if you feel stiff, if you look stiff, if if I know you're inflamed, then I need that transporter to have healthy cells to move across. And I need those same cells to do things like make progesterone. I need cellular health on lots of different levels and lots of different glands. So omega-3s is a big one of mine. Yeah. I do a lot of sort of brain, since we're talking about it, like brain HPA axis adaptogens with just the amount of sheer stress in our day and age that people are exposed to every day. I find that using things like bacopa, using things like ginkgo, using things like ashwagandha and rhodiola and cordyceps. I'm big into the mushrooms. I find reishi, lion's mane, maca, which is not a mushroom, but I use a lot of maca in patients. And I just find that having that extra Band-Aid or, safety net is probably a better word, makes a big difference for a lot of people. They can, people that are like, I meditate, I sleep, I say no, I set boundaries, and I'm still really like I still can't escape all the stress. I'm like, all right, let's look at some of these sort of brain adrenal adaptogens.
Where do you categorize Vitex in that? Because I consider it an adaptogen, but a lot of people don't consider it as
I call it an ovarian adaptogen. I call it an ovarian adaptogen. And I actually read, I think, a paper recently where they called it that. I was like, I coined that years ago.
You can't take that.
You can't take that. I'm trademarking that. So I tell people, because technically Vitex is supposed to affect dopamine, which affects prolactin, which is how it affects progesterone production. But what I find is it does so much more. I think it's just the greatest little herb about brain to ovarian health. That's what I tell people.
Yeah.
So I use it for lots of stuff.
Yeah, I love Vitex too. It's one of the ones that it seems to be clinically one of the ones that I can. There's very few things you can be like, you know what, try Vitex or try this thing and have some benefit. And I typically get great benefits, although it does seem to be an herb that takes a little bit of time
3 months
to work. And I don't know if you see that as well.
Yeah. I tell women, give it at least 3 months. Don't get to the end of your first cycle and think this is bogus.
Yeah.
Because it takes 3 months to get from a primordial cell all the way up to the chosen follicle that's going to release the egg. So I'm like, we got to work with your rhythm that your ovaries are doing. So big fan of Chase Tree. Vitex.
Yeah, same. Any others? Actually, you mentioned ashwagandha, one of my favorites. Rhodiola is another one of my favorites.
Be careful though. If you found that rhodiola is really drying, depending on the dose, do you ever get that?
Well, what I have found with both of those is that rhodiola is supposed to be a little bit stimulating, and that's what you tend to see. It helps with energy. I can also see it being very sedating in a small minority of people, and ashwagandha, the opposite. So I oftentimes warn people about those things. Ashwagandha tends to be very calming, but I've seen it be very stimulating in some people. And you get this kind of effect in with these adaptogens. They're wonderful. But I would say, I don't know, I'll probably say maybe 5% of people. It's been rare, but it happens enough clinically that I warn people about that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also a good reminder for people like, herbs are still, they're medicinal, right? Mm-hmm. So just they could really affect what's going on, it hopefully in a positive way, which is what we're trying to do, but sometimes in a negative way. I was at a conference once with a girlfriend of mine, my very best friend, and she'd been telling me that she, on 2 separate conversations that did not relate, on the one hand, she said, I've started adaptogens, but this one I'm doing is rhodiola based. And then on a separate conversation, she said, I've been experiencing really dry mouth and dry eyes. What do you think's going on? And then we happened to be in a lecture with a herbalist, and the herbalist was going through the adaptogens, and he hit rhodiola, and he's like, and rhodiola can be very stimulating, and it can be extremely drying. It's really good for those women who get night sweats, but not good for people with dry eyes and dry mouth. And we were like,
so interesting, right? That's why it's great to get a bunch of people with clinical experience, right? Mm-hmm. For those of you listening, we oftentimes talk about research all the time, and Dr. Jones and I are definitely research junkies. I know that about you. You're kind of a nerd, like I'm a nerd reading research, but I oftentimes pick up some of the most wonderful tidbits just from people's clinical experience, it makes a big difference. And one of the ways, by the way, that I'm doing this, and I want to get your thought on this, when I think about restoring hormonal function, typically I go lifestyle stuff first and always. Sure. In fact, if you don't do that, pretty much nothing else works. Mm-hmm. Then I'll typically move into things like nutrients and things like that, zinc, magnesium, some of the ones that most of these hormonal enzyme systems use. Mm-hmm. Then I move into the herbal realm, which we just talked about, specifically adaptogens, and partly because I'm addressing what you talked about with the hypothalamus sort of being the command and control center of all of this. And then I move into pro-hormones and then hormones. And I'm wondering where you go with that next. Do you jump right to hormones at that point if the herbs aren't doing the trick, or do you ever use pro-hormones in any way?
I do. And then sometimes I'll do it right from the get-go. It depends on the person. It depends how depleted they are. It depends how desperate they are. Yeah. And it depends how, if I'm going to hit them with the baseball bat or if we're just going to nudge them along because they're a really sensitive person. So sometimes I have people that are like, I will do anything. I'm at my wit's end, but I don't have the energy. And I use the pro hormones. Like, look, we're going to use them as a Band-Aid while we're using the lifestyle, the nutrients, the adaptogens. Sometimes I'm using everything at once with the idea and the intention that I will gradually be pulling them away. Like as you get better and as you're making these changes and as it's sitting in for you, then I'm going to gradually pull this back and you're going to continue to feel better because you're going to know what to do. But if I've got somebody who maybe can't use hormones or they're not ready for hormones, I agree like you, I've got it sort of at the end of my hierarchy. But it depends on the person.
Yeah. And so which ones would you be using primarily? I'm sure DHEA is in there.
I use a lot of DHEA. I do use a lot of DHEA. I did not use a lot of things like pregnenolone. So pregnenolone, people ask, well, if you don't believe in the pregnenolone steal, why do you give pregnenolone? I'm like, well, it's still very calming. So pregnenolone works on the brain. When pregnenolone goes through first pass in the liver, it turns into something called allo, A-L-L-O, allo. And allo crosses the blood-brain barrier and supports GABA. And GABA is our calming hormone. So a lot of people take pregnenolone because they love how it feels in their brain. They love how they feel calm, how that affects their stress. And so I will use pregnenolone, but I use a lot of DHEA. Absolutely. I just warn people, of the side effects. And
yeah, it's interesting. Pregnenolone is one of those things that I have, for women, especially going through perimenopause.
Yeah.
I'll oftentimes just use oral micronized progesterone, but pregnenolone I oftentimes find is just doing the trick just as well, sometimes better. Sometimes you go right to that and it just calms them down and lets them sleep.
Yeah. And oral micronized progesterone and pregnenolone work for the same pathway. So, as you know, right, oral progesterone breaks down into eventually allo as well. So allo and pregnenolone do the same thing. They cross the blood-brain barrier, touch on GABA. So,
and you can, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the time now you can find the oral micronized progesterone over the counter now for many people. Not that we necessarily want them doing that, but
the cream topical is over the counter and FDA approved at the moment. There are some companies that do have primarily for practitioners. You don't need a prescription. They're not compounded, but there are some companies out there that do have it as a dropper. They're like a tincture.
Yep.
And they can be really, they're an oil, so they can be really, really helpful for women. And I'll definitely use it in some women. Sometimes I'll just use cycling progesterone while I'm using Vitex as well. B6 and other support to get them ovulating or get them back on track. Just be real careful with progesterone for people who are listening. It's same feedback loop. It can go back to the brain and go, she has progesterone. She doesn't need it. And the brain goes, oh, okay, then I won't ovulate this month. So if you're trying to encourage ovulation, do it after ovulation, not before. Make sure she's hit that whatever day she ovulates to move forward.
So is this the idea behind not giving something like progesterone all through the month, but giving it just the 14 days, or prior, after the ovulation? So that's kind of what you're speaking to there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on age. If she's perimenopausal or menopausal, then I do it way differently. If she's perimenopausal, she's not going to ovulate with any regularity. And there's I don't use Vitex much. As they're into perimenopause, moving into menopause, I don't find that Vitex works that well. Vitex is great for the woman who should be ovulating, not for the woman who's transitioning out. Same with progesterone. If she's 46 with irregular cycles and hot flashes, I'm like, oh, we're going to do it most every day.
Yeah. Same with me. I mean, for me, Vitex is one of those things. Younger women who should be normally cycling, who have been under stress, and I see a lot of athletes who are coming back and not being able to have a return to ovulation and fertility issues. Vitex is wonderful, but I agree. Perimenopause, I start moving more into the hormone therapies, and there's some pretty good studies on progesterone use in perimenopause, and I think that's becoming way more mainstream now, just progesterone sort of by itself. But let's get into some of the stuff that I just, I want to be educated on, because this is the area where, I'm kind of lost in this, and I'll frame this for everyone, and then you can kind of get me straight. But here's the way I've always seen this. So as I was working in my career, working with mainly women, part of the reason I became expert in endocrinology is because I was working with mostly women. And what I found, and I kind of want to just see what your take is on this and how you've either, if this was your experience or not, and then where to go from there. But what I found is I ran so many serum hormones, right? So estrogen, progesterone levels, snapshot in time. And then I moved to, saliva and blood spotting types, or blood spots, and used a lot of ZRT labs and stuff like that, trying to get cycles. And here's what I ultimately found. I have to say that overall, with using testing to try to guide me, I was always a little bit disappointed in what I was seeing on the test, and then making recommendations based off of that, and not getting necessarily the clinical outcomes I wanted, compared to just using my clinical judgment based on symptomology and then making recommendations. And so what ended up happening for me is, over time, I started running less and less hormone panels, because I just didn't see the direct correlation between, here's what I'm seeing on your hormones, here's what we can do. The hormones change directly and the symptoms fix themselves. Normally, I would see it the other way around. I'd almost see it like, here's your symptomology. I'm going to make a best guess based on what I know that these hormones do. I'm going to make these interventions, And it worked better always for me that way. And so I've always had this sort of push and pull where I would love to be able to have a clinical tool that really gives me good information about the hormones in the body that also correlates really well with signs and symptoms. And so you obviously, and I'll let you tell a little bit about, what you're doing and what you're educating us all on, but that's been my dilemma. And so I just wanted to kind of get your take on that and also hear sort of your recommendations around this and whether you even saw this at all yourself.
Oh, 100%. The first thing I'll say, not that you do this, but since I talk to practitioners all day long and look at thousands of tests, full disclosure. So I am the medical director for the Dutch test, which is owned by Precision Analytical. However, I've been in this field. I graduated from medical school in 2005, but I was involved in the naturopathic school since 1999. So 20 years in this field of hormones, serum, saliva, blood spot. I've used all of it. A lot. And so the first thing I will remind practitioners is that when you are looking at a woman's hormones, you have to make sure you know where in her cycle she is. You don't do this, but plenty of practitioners will fight me and go, what does it matter? It changes all the time. I'm like, that's the point.
Exactly.
We need to know where she is because progesterone only comes out in the second half in the luteal phase. So if you check her progesterone on day 4 and it's near 0, I'm like, of course it is. She hasn't ovulated yet. But if you check her on day, let's pretend 19, 20, 21-ish, assuming she ovulates on day 14, then you should, in theory, hit her at her peak of progesterone. So where she is in her cycle definitely matters first and foremost. Second thing is, just like you said, when you are looking at these one-day tests, they are literally 1 day out of her cycle. So she's a 28-day girl. You're looking at 1 day out of 28. And I have found this over and over and over again because Dutch, much like at other companies, even the saliva companies do this, is that they will run what's called a cycle, right? All month long, you collect a sample 1 day every morning, all throughout your cycle, and then it gets graphed out. Your estrogen rise and fall and rise again, and then your progesterone is low, and then it should go up and go down. What I have found over and over is that the 1 day testing can miss a lot because you're not getting the full macroscopic look of the whole cycle. Yep. And they will bring me their blood work and show my progesterone is low or my estradiol looks really low and menopausal, but I have PMS and heavy periods and fibroids and all these things that indicate I don't have low estrogen. What's the problem? When we do the cycle mapping, what we see is they dip, and we caught them at the dip, and then they bounce back up again, and it's really super common. And in fact, when they bounce, they tend to bounce really quite high. And so that is the struggle with the 1 day test: is you get a snapshot in time, and sometimes you nail it, and sometimes you caught her on a dip, and then what do you do? And then I would do the same thing you do. I'm like, well, this blood work shows your estradiol is low, but I don't think it is. I think just on this 1 day it is. Thanks for spending your money on this 1 day. And we're going to address it the way I think your symptoms line up. Now, having said that, the bonuses that I like of using urine testing, which is what Dutch is, we're a dried urine company, is that you get the hormones, but you get where they go. So for example, when you run an estradiol in serum, I can tell you what your estradiol is in serum. When you run it in saliva, I can tell you what it is in saliva, but I can't tell you its metabolism pathway. I can't tell you its phase 1 and phase 2 detox, which is the bonus when you look at dried urine testing, or even those of you who are doing 24-hour urine testing. It's just more of a pain to collect. So now I can tell you, if you catch them on a day and their estradiol is quite elevated and they have all the matching symptoms, now I can tell you, are they stuck at phase 1? Are they stuck at phase 2? Are they stuck, is it an increased aromatization issue? Same for men. Men can have elevated estrogen and have the same detox issues. And then I can focus in on how we can sort of unplug those blocked detox pathways. Or I may suggest additional testing. Phase 3 is done in stool testing, which our company doesn't do. But when I'm consulting, I'll say, hey, what's going on with their gut? Obviously, we often start with the gut. So fix the gut. That's the sewer line out of the house. Let's unplug that, and that will greatly help your estrogen move, and then work backwards from there. So that's why I do like urine testing, be it dried, which is obviously biased, or 24-hour as well, because you get these great pathways that we can fix through diet, lifestyle, and supplements.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the more conventional practitioners who listen are going to be, asking about, well, what is, how is that diagnostic? How,
Right.
what is the science saying about that? And so I know you probably have an answer for that, but to me, this is a true functional. It's a
Yeah.
functional test, which is a little bit different than, what most people will be thinking about. But what's your comment to that, where the people are saying, well, this isn't necessarily proven. We've always used serum. This is
Right.
what all the research is based on. So what's your take on that?
So right now, the research, a lot of the serum, of course, is they consider gold standard. Our company in particular has a published study out that compares dried urine, estradiol, and progesterone to serum estradiol and progesterone, and shows it's excellent correlation. So for the people who are using dried urine, the Dutch test is an example. We have the data to prove that is as a good correlation as serum. But for those who were like, oh, I don't know about that estrogen detox, I don't know about that estrogen metabolism, I get pushback on that too. I'm like, man, that's been in the research for years, because
Yeah.
urine, right? Urine is what we had for years. And if you wanted to look up those pathways, if you look up 2-hydroxy, 4-hydroxy, quinone pathways, breast cancer, DNA addicts, like any of these buzzwords, you'll see tons of information on PubMed on how these particular estrogen pathways can potentially increase carcinogenesis, increase DNA damage and mutation, and potentially lead to estrogen-related cancers, or cancers in general. And so that research is really strong in the literature.
Yeah. So one of the things about our profession that I do kind of love is that our profession has kind of been all over this stuff for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to do a lot on the art side of things, art and science. And, I think that, to me, I love that about us. The thing that I might hate about us too is that we get a little bit of stuck in sort of the art side when the research is clarifying things. So to me, it's like this constant balance between the art and the science of this. But I guess my final question about this testing then, so if you were going to say, all right, you're a woman who's sort of dealing with hormonal related issues, and we sort of sorted out and, learned from you that, there's other hormones sort of that you want to take care of first that are usually addressed through stress management and lifestyle. But now we're down to the sex steroids, and we're looking at estrogen and progesterone.
Mm-hmm.
And like you mentioned, like men, estrogen is hugely important too, for erections especially. And so men who are dealing with that want to be looking at testosterone and estrogen. But now that we're there, what would you suggest now with the testing? Because do you feel like, all right, everybody should, if we're practitioners, should we all be looking at, and I have my opinion about this, but should we all be looking at across the cycle? I mean, should that be our new gold standard in terms of, if we want to assess hormones for a woman, we should be looking at the entire cycle, not a snapshot? Is that where you come down on this? And primarily, we also want to know these detox pathways. So urine is your sort of chosen modality.
Urine is my chosen modality, because if you're going to manipulate estrogen and progesterone, and even testosterone, especially in men or women, testosterone and DHEA go down pathways that can worsen symptoms as well. If they're, for example, like the DHT pathway, right? 5-alpha reductase, women increase acne and hirsutism and anger and all these things. So when it comes to testing, if she can afford it, I am a big fan of testing all throughout the cycle. Let me step back. If her cycles are fairly consistent, but they're always symptomatic, then I'm a big fan of testing all throughout the cycle if she can afford it. Yeah. If her cycles are irregular, if she's perimenopausal, if she's like, well, some months I'm 23 days and some days I'm 34 days, I don't know what's going on, then I am not a fan of testing throughout the cycle, because a 23-day cycle is going to be different than a 34-day cycle. So I'm more of a fan of figuring out why she's so irregular, if it's not age, and address that, and then come back to the hormones. Figure out the why first, and then come back to the hormones. You may fix the hormones in the process of figuring out the why. But if she's symptomatic throughout the cycle, if she says, some women are very particular. They're like, I'm symptomatic on day 13, day 16, and day, 25 through 28. I'm like, well, that's more than a one-day test. Let's do the whole month and see what's going on. Or I have women who go, I get migraines at around mid-luteal or mid-cycle and at PMS. I'm like, well, then we have to do the whole month, because a one-day test is not going to tell me at ovulation or before ovulation. I need to know. But if she's just screening for hormones, if hormones are a problem but not her biggest concern, a lot of these companies loop cortisol and other neat markers into it. So I'm like, if we're just looking for one quick and easy test, I can get a snapshot of your hormones. I can get a snapshot of your detox pathways. I can get real specific on your cortisol. I can look at things like your melatonin and some other organic acid markers. Then I will do just the 1-day Dutch test and start there. And I found that to be really quite effective. So it depends. It depends on the person. Yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question in terms of prioritizing hormone testing.
Yeah.
Dutch has a test that looks at these big ones, right?
Yeah.
So it has a test that looks at all the sex steroids and cortisol and DHEA and all that. So that would be the regular Dutch test that people see. You kind of have this one all-in-one, very functional test that looks at this. And I guess just one brief thing. So in terms of cortisol saliva and cortisol urinary markers, what are your thoughts about that? And
cortisol for sure is the gold standard when it comes to so our saliva is the gold standard when it comes to cortisol testing. Dried urine testing is a really good surrogate, matches up really pretty well. We're trying to get research published on that. But when it comes to things like the cortisol awakening response, which is the response of cortisol first thing in the morning, it's the rise in cortisol in your first 20 to 30 minutes of waking. It's what helps flip you from conscious to alert in the morning. Then that's absolutely cortisol. And so Dutch is actually included. We now have salivette swabs. So instead of tubes that you have to spit in, they're like cotton rolls that you use. And so we absolutely have that option to do a combination urine for the pathways and saliva swabs for easy cortisol collection.
To capture that cortisol awakening response, which is huge, for, glad you kind of brought that up because it's one of those things people are always sort of talking about, let me get the cortisol rhythm. You really want that cortisol awakening response. It may be, in my mind, the most important aspect of capturing a cortisol. Of course, you want that rhythm, but you definitely want that cortisol awakening response.
It's the biggest indicator for things like resiliency, inflammation, infection response. What's the other? Autoimmune. It has a huge impact on autoimmune, mood, all sorts of stuff. And if it's too high, too low, it'll affect all those things. And people usually know. I'll ask them, how do you feel in the morning? What's going on in the morning? And they'll say, well, after 2 cups of coffee, and in a couple hours, I feel great. I'm like, you got a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Your awakening response is not good. And then the opposite.
Or their blood sugars are, spiked through the roof and they're not really insulin resistant for any other reason, but they're just getting this huge cortisol and adrenaline output that's pumping up their blood sugars, which you oftentimes see in people who are intermittent fasting and keto dieting and stuff like that.
You got it.
So really interesting stuff. So, all right, I want to be respectful of your time, but I guess one of the things I love asking, sort of professionals like you after you kind of go through this is just to go through kind of the things that are exciting you now. You're on sort of, I know you are like me, you're constantly always studying and your thought processes are evolving and you're constantly lecturing. So questions come up and insights develop. And so, this could be anything that's a hypothesis or anything you're just excited about learning about or something new. Just give us an idea of sort of, Dr. Jones's sort of thought process about, how she sees things going in whatever direction you choose, just to kind of give us some insight or things that you think we should all be aware of that we're making big mistakes of that you've kind of figured out.
Well, I would say since we're on the topic of cortisol and I lecture so much about the cortisol awakening response, I think that's the biggest thing that I'm researching right now. Like I said earlier, I was been researching a lot into the circadian rhythm. And like you said, most practitioners talk about the grand sweeping rhythm that you should be up in the morning and down at night, which you should. But as I learn more and more about the specific first 20 to 30 minutes of what happens after you wake up, it's so telling of your health right there in the immediate and in the future. And by being able to modulate that awakening response, and it's so easy to do, it doesn't require a lot of money, but it does require some habit. It could really make a huge impact on people. Just the autoimmune piece alone is just mind-blowing to me. Just for people who don't know, when your immune system, when your T cells or when you make T cells, when you're differentiating them, your body runs them through your thymus gland, not thyroid, but thymus. And the thymus gland checks them to make it easy for autoimmunity. It's called self-tolerance. And if you fail self-tolerance, if you we're accidentally created as an autoimmune T cell, and you shouldn't be. Then in my head, the body pulls it aside, like, little T cell, you need to come over here. You have to die, right? Like, we can't put you in circulation. That would be bad. We're going to kill you. So one of the triggering things to kill these inappropriately made T cells is the cortisol awakening response. So when people say to me, hey, my autoimmune symptoms were really under control and now they're back, and I'll go, how's your morning? And they're like, oh, it's bad in the morning. It's real bad in the morning. I'm like, I think you have an awakening response issue. I don't think it's high enough or peaked enough. Let's address that. The people who tell me that they're now waking up in pain, they now wake up inflamed. It takes them a good hour, they're like, oh yeah, I wake up really painful and stiff. It takes me a good hour, and after an hour, then I get moving. We often think of arthritis-y type stuff, but you need that cortisol. Cortisol is suppressive to inflammatory cytokines. And I right away, I'm like, just by answering a few questions, I'm like, I know what your awakening response is not doing. And if we can address it appropriately, I can affect so many things: autoimmune pain, inflammation, infection, blood sugar, mood. And it's like I said, it's pretty easy to manipulate. And I mean that in a positive way. We want to manipulate it to be positive. So
it's
that's
such a
what I'm
good clinical
studying.
pearl. And is that why you make such a big deal about sort of the circadian rhythm and light exposure and that kind of stuff? Is that where a lot of that's coming from?
Absolutely. And the other big thing is supplement timing. So for people who let's say you've got a patient and you're like, hey, take this ashwagandha or rhodiola in the morning. What do people do? They get up, they get ready, they take a shower, they eat breakfast, and then they take their rhodiola. But if you're trying to impact their cortisol awakening response that happens in the first 20 to 30 minutes of waking, guess what? You better take that rhodiola in the first 20 to 30 minutes of waking. The sooner the better if you're trying to impact it. Same for the reverse. If you have a too high awakening response, you shoot for the moon. And you're giving them, as an example, L-theanine, let's say, phosphatidylserine. I tell people, take it on waking. Literally have it at your bedside. Take it on waking, because you have to impact that awakening response right away. Don't wait 2 hours until you finally get to work, and take your morning supplements at, 9 a.m. Take it when you wake up. It'll make a huge difference.
Such good stuff. I have one question just popped in my head. I don't know if you're going to have an answer to this, but it's just, might just be interesting for you. With me in particular, I have this very weird thing where if I do any kind of salivary catch for cortisol, it is non-existent. I have never seen cortisol register on any saliva test for me.
What is wrong with your salivary glands?
Exactly. Right. So,
but Jade, I bet do they see? That's the thing with other saliva companies is they don't test your cortisone.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I've actually never done a Dutch test on myself, which I will now.
Turns out the other thing is
exactly. Turns out I know someone who can help me out.
Yep.
But the other thing is, so for a long time, and I did have lots and lots of fatigue-based issues. I have hypothyroid, Hashimoto's, which I've pretty much cleared of that. But then at one point I was like, all right, well, let me just test my serum. And then my serum cortisol is high normal, sort of high normal. So it's just an interesting sort of thing here with the saliva thing. I just thought I'd throw at you. But,
well, I have a hypothesis, but then we can wrap up. So cortisol's active, right? Cortisol's active. It's what binds to receptors and does the things. Cortisone is inactive, and you have an enzyme that dictates which one you're going to be. So you always make cortisol first, and then different glands and parts of the body can keep it active or deactivate it. So the salivary glands, the kidneys, your intestines, your sweat glands have really high levels of this enzyme, 11-beta HSD2, that deactivates to cortisone. So it's possible you have an excessive amount of 11-beta HSD2 in your saliva gland. And therefore, when you do other cortisol testing, your cortisol registers near zero, but your cortisone is probably quite elevated, which is why on Dutch tests, we give you both. We give you cortisol and cortisone because we recognize the kidney has a whole lot of this enzyme for protective purposes, to protect from kidney damage and high blood pressure and stuff like that. And we will see people who have really high cortisone, which tells me they had cortisol that was high and the kidney's trying to protect itself.
Yeah.
So
and that would make perfect sense for me in my clinical sort of picture. So thank you for your genius for that. And I'll get the Dutch test and see. We'll kind of correlate and see how that works.
Let's see.
But I appreciate you so much. You're such a genius. Thanks for all the work that you're doing for all of us, and thanks for spending time with us today, Dr.
Oh my
Carrie
gosh, thank
Jones.
you so much. I appreciate it.
Where should I send people to find you? I follow you on Instagram, so give them your
Instagram.
Instagram handle
Yeah.
and anywhere else where they can get in touch with you.
I hang out on Instagram all the time. So it's at dr.carriejones. Come find me, come hang out. All I do is education. I do work for Dutch, but I'm not trying to sell anything. So yeah, take a look. It's all endocrinology.
Yeah, it's your account is one of, I have a few people that it's my education, it's like your account is just fantastic. So if you want this kind of education, and actually I would say way more, just really amazing stuff, go check her out on Instagram. Thank you, my friend. I will see you soon. I'll see you on the social medias.
I'll see you on the IG.
All right. See ya.